Welcome to Sanctuary Stories, the podcast where we explore the lives of extraordinary people who have sought sanctuary and gone on to inspire the world. I'm Phil, and in every episode, we dive deep into the life of one remarkable individual, someone who turned adversity into strength, transformed pain into purpose, and left a legacy of resilience, courage, and hope. Some of our stories are about quiet determination. Others are filled with dramatic moments that feel like scenes from a film. But all of them remind us of one simple truth, that sanctuary is not just a place, it's a lifeline. It's what allows people not only to survive, but to thrive. Today's episode is one of those stories that almost defies belief. It's about a teenage girl who fled the devastation of war with nothing but determination in her heart and her sister by her side. A girl who boarded a flimsy, overcrowded dinghy with strangers in the dead of night, hoping to reach safety across the sea. And when the boat began to sink, she did something extraordinary. She jumped into the freezing water alongside her sister and swam for over 3 hours, pulling the boat to safety and saving every life on board. That moment would have been remarkable enough, but that was only the beginning, because that girl, brave, exhausted, and just 17 years old, would go on to become an Olympic swimmer, a UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador, a published author, and a global advocate for refugee rights. She would walk into Olympic stadiums bearing not just a flag, but the hopes of millions of displaced people. And she would do it all with humility, humour, and a fierce belief in the power of second chances. Her name is Yusra Mardini, and this is the story of how she swam her way from survival to stardom, from the chaos of war to the global stage. A story about sisterhood, sacrifice, and the strength it takes, not just to keep your head above water, but to carry others with you. So get comfortable, because today you're going to hear what it truly means to swim against the current and come out the other side, changed, unbroken, and shining. Yusra was born in Damascus in 1998 into what she describes as a happy and comfortable family life. Her father, Izzat, was a former swimmer and coach who introduced her to the water before she could even properly walk. By the time she was 3, Yusra was already splashing around with perfect confidence, and soon after, she was swimming laps like a natural. As a child, she had energy to burn, always talking, always laughing, always moving. And her mother used to joke that the only time Yusra was quiet was when she was underwater. Her days were split between school, swim practice, and teasing her sisters. She was energetic and cheeky, once hiding a frog in her coach's bag just to see the reaction. Yusra's childhood in Damascus was full of sunshine, noise, and water. The Mardini home was busy and bustling, with Yusra, her 2 sisters, and their parents creating a joyful, slightly chaotic environment that felt worlds away from the conflict that would eventually follow. As the middle child, Yusra often described herself as the noisy one, always asking questions, always wanting to prove herself. Her older sister, Sarah, was more rebellious, bolder, wilder, and little Shahad, the youngest, was the baby of the family. But it was Uzra who had the biggest competitive streak. Swimming became a major part of her life early on. Her father was strict, but he believed in her. They'd wake up early to train before school, And while other children were still wiping sleep from their eyes, Yusra was already swimming laps. She complained sometimes, of course. She was a child. But deep down, she loved the discipline. It gave her a sense of purpose. Outside of training, Yusra loved hanging out with friends in her Damascus neighborhood. They'd ride bikes in the narrow streets, run errands for their mothers, and spend hours playing imaginary games. She loved singing in the car on family road trips and doing silly dances with Sarah when no one was watching. One of her favourite memories was of diving off the high board at the local swimming centre when she was just 9, terrified but determined to show the older boys that she could do it. She belly flopped with a loud splash and came up laughing, red-cheeked but triumphant. "I'll get it next time," she shouted, undeterred. The family lived in a relatively stable life in the early 2000s. Her mother worked at the Ministry of Education, and her father gave swimming lessons. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable. Education was a priority, and so was sport. There were birthday parties, big family dinners, and trips to local cafes where Yusra would order fruit juice and quietly eavesdrop on the adults. It was, by all accounts, a normal, loving childhood. Competitive swimming became a big part of her life. She was proud to represent Syria internationally, dreaming of one day standing on an Olympic podium. Her bedroom walls were plastered with posters of her heroes, Michael Phelps, of course, but also strong female athletes who inspired her. Outside of the pool, she was a typical teenager. She loved hanging out with her sisters, messing around with TikTok-style dance routines before TikTok even existed, and always had a mischievous sense of humour. Once, when her coach told her to stop being a clown during training, she swam to the other side of the pool and came back wearing a snorkel and a plastic duck ring. That got her benched for the day, but everyone remembered it and laughed. But beneath the surface of normalcy, Syria was growing increasingly unstable. To understand Yusra's story, it's important to understand why she had to leave in the first place. The Syrian civil war began in 2011, but the tensions had been building for years. Syria was ruled by President Bashar al-Assad, whose regime had long been accused of suppressing dissent, curbing civil liberties, and responding brutally to oppression. Inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings sweeping across the Middle East, Syrian citizens began peacefully protesting for democracy, freedom, and political reform. But the government responded with extreme force, cracking down on protesters with arrests, torture, and violence. What began as a peaceful demonstration soon spiraled into full-blown conflict. Opposition groups took up arms and Syria fractured into complex and brutal civil war involving the Assad regime, rebel fractions, extremist groups like ISIS, and international powers. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Cities were bombed. Schools, hospitals, and even homes were reduced to rubble. Millions were displaced. By the time Yusra was in her teens, Damascus was no longer a safe place to grow up or swim. When the civil war broke out, everything changed. Bombing attacks became part of daily life. One day, during swim practice, a bomb exploded just outside the pool. Water sloshed over the edges, and panic erupted. That moment stayed with Yusra. How something as normal as training could be interrupted by something as terrifying as war. Her dreams were put on hold. Competitions were cancelled. Training became impossible. The pool was damaged, and worst of all, her family's neighbourhood was no longer safe. When the Arab Spring protests started in 2011, the Syrian regime responded with violence. Things quickly changed. Her school days became shorter. Power outages were frequent. The background noise of life became the distant thud of shelling and sharp crack of gunfire. Yusra remembers a time when she and her classmates were evacuated during a swimming competition. Sirens going off mid-race, swimmers scrambling out of the water. She later said that she didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation at first. It was surreal. One day she was thinking about which goggles she liked best, and the next she was packing a bag to leave her country. The child who used to race her sister to the end of the street was suddenly racing time to escape a war zone. As the war escalated in Syria, life for Yusra and her family became unbearable. Bombings were no longer occasional, they were constant. Her school closed, her swimming pool was bombed, her friends were fleeing or disappearing. The streets she once raced through on her bike became checkpoints and rubble. Her parents tried to stay hopeful, but it was clear the war was not ending anytime soon. One of the final straws was when their home was partially destroyed in an airstrike. No one was killed, but it was a terrifying reminder that nowhere was safe, not even home. Her parents, knowing the risks, made the agonizing decision to send Yusra and her older sister Sarah to Europe. It was a decision that no parent should ever have to make, to say goodbye to their daughters, not knowing if they would ever return. But they believed it was the only way to keep them alive and give them a future. In the summer of 2015, Yusra and Sarah left Syria with forged documents, a small amount of money, and a desperate sense of hope. Their journey began in Lebanon, where they crossed the border by foot under the cover of night. From there, they travelled to Turkey, first to Istanbul and then to Izmir on the western coast. They relied on smugglers to guide the way, and each step was filled with fear. Fear of being caught, of being robbed, of being trafficked, of dying. The smugglers were often cold and indifferent, focused only on payment and logistics. There were times when they were crammed into the backs of vans, kept in safe houses with dozens of other people, and moved at odd hours to avoid detection. They ate little, slept even less, and constantly looked over their shoulders. Yusra would later recall how the smugglers treated them like luggage, not people. We weren't humans to them, we were cargo, she said. Still, she clung to her sister, who had become a fierce protector, shielding Yusra from the worst of the interactions, and even threatening one smuggler who tried to touch her inappropriately. He didn't expect me to fight back, Sarah later said, but I did. Yusra later said it was on these nights, packed in with dozens of other scared people, that she began to understand how many millions of others were fleeing too. After weeks of hiding and waiting, they finally reached the Turkish coast. It was there that the smugglers ushered them towards the next and most dangerous leg of their journey, crossing the Aegean Sea to Lesbos, Greece, in a tiny rubber dinghy. The boat was meant for 6 to 8 people. Nearly 20 were crammed inside, including children, elderly passengers, and others like Yusra and Sarah, terrified, exhausted, but desperate for freedom. The sisters hesitated. The sea was choppy, the sky was dark, but the smugglers shouted at them to get in or be left behind. So they climbed in, clutching their backpacks and each other. Not long into the crossing, disaster struck. The engine failed and the boat began to drift. It started taking on water. Panic spread quickly. People screamed, some prayed, others wept. It became clear the boat was sinking, and they were far from shore. Most of the passengers couldn't swim. Without hesitation, the four of them jumped into the freezing water. For over 3 hours, they pushed and pulled the boat, guiding it towards the shore, while trying to calm the panicked passengers inside. Yusra later admitted that the only thing going through her head was, "Don't die. Don't let anyone else die. Just keep going." She swam with one arm while holding the rope with the other. When asked how she managed it later, she joked, "Turns out my swimming training really came in handy for a surprise career in maritime rescue." The sun began to rise as they finally reached the rocky shores of Lesbos, exhausted and trembling. Yusra collapsed on the beach, but everyone on board survived. They had made it. She had made it. And in doing so, she'd already become a hero long before the world knew her name. It would be months before she would find her way to Berlin, and even longer before she'd compete on the world stage. But that morning, on the edge of Greece, soaked to the bone and shivering in borrowed clothes, Yusra Mardini was already something extraordinary. A survivor, a protector, and a symbol of strength it takes to seek sanctuary, not just for yourself, but for others. Their act of bravery saved everyone on board. When they reached land, Yusra collapsed from exhaustion, but alive and more determined than ever. Yusra and Sarah eventually made their way to Berlin, where they applied for asylum and were granted refugee status. At first, the adjustment was hard. They didn't speak German. They were still grieving the home they'd left behind, and Yusra had left the Olympic dreams somewhere back in the sea. But life has a way of circling back. One day, while wandering through a local swimming centre, Yusra met coach Sven Spannenkrebs. He watched her swim once and knew he had a rare talent on his hands. He agreed to train her free of charge while she settled into life in Germany. She quickly returned to form and set her sights on the impossible. In 2016, just a year after arriving in Germany, Yusra was selected for the very first refugee Olympic team by the International Olympic Committee. She walked into the stadium during the opening ceremony in Rio de Janeiro, carrying the Olympic flag. The world erupted into applause. Her journey had come full circle, from swimming for survival to swimming on sport's greatest stage. And being Yusra, she didn't take herself too seriously. When reporters swarmed her at the games, she grinned and said, "I hope I swim faster than I run from journalists." After the Olympics, Yusra's fame grew, but she used her platform not for vanity, but for visibility. She became the youngest UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador, sharing her story to bring light to refugee experiences around the world. She spoke at the United Nations, gave interviews, wrote a memoir called Butterfly, and never forgot that millions were still on the move, still struggling to find safety. Her sister Sarah, also a former swimmer, stayed away from the spotlight until The Swimmers was released in 2022. The Netflix film, directed by Sally Al-Hossani, told the sister's story with raw emotion and honesty. Yusra worked closely with the production team, insisting on authenticity, even helping choreograph the swimming scenes. When asked if she could play herself in the movie, she laughed. "No way. I can swim, but I can't act. My dramatic range is one eyebrow." Today, Yusra splits her time between Germany and the UK, balancing her athletic training with an ever-growing schedule of global speaking engagements, advocacy work, and humanitarian outreach. Though she is still committed to swimming, her role has evolved beyond the pool. She now sees herself as a voice for those whose stories are often silenced. After competing once again in the Refugee Olympic team at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, held in 2021 due to the pandemic, Yusra made it clear that her mission is about far more than medals. Her presence on the world's biggest sporting stage wasn't just about competition. It was about visibility, about showing the world what displaced people can achieve when they're given a chance. Yusra continues to speak at international forums, from United Nations summits to global conferences on youth leadership, climate change, and displacement. Her passion for girls' education and refugees' rights is unwavering, and she often visits schools, camps, and community centres, listening to the stories of those who remind her of herself, young, determined, and dreaming of something more. She's particularly vocal about the need for long-term support for refugee youth, including access to mental health services, education, and meaningful pathways to citizenship and employment. She also became a familiar face in global media, appearing in interviews, documentaries, and panels alongside world leaders and fellow activists. But for all her success, Yusra remains grounded. She still FaceTimes her mum before big events, still gets nervous before speaking on stage, and still trains like an underdog. When asked how she manages it all, she smiled and said, "I just try to show up, because that's what so many people need. Someone who shows up and says, 'You're not invisible.'" Through her work, Yusra continues to reshape how the world sees refugees, not as victims of circumstance, but as people full of purpose, talent, and drive. Whether she's speaking at Davos, signing books, or swimming laps at dawn, she carries with her the memory of that sinking boat and the belief that no one should ever be left behind. Despite her achievements, she stays humble. In interviews, she credits her family, her coach, and even strangers who helped her along the way. "I didn't do this alone," she says. "I just swam. The world lifted me up." Yusra Mardini's story is more than just a tale of survival. It is a living, breathing testament to what it means to create sanctuary, not only for oneself, but for others. She began her journey as a frightened teenager, fleeing a crumbling homeland, thrust into waters that were meant to drown her, but instead became the proving ground for her courage. She swam for her life and for the lives of strangers, and when she reached safety, she didn't stop. She didn't retreat into comfort or turn away from the past. Instead, she chose to speak out, to stand up, and to lift others as she rose. Yusra didn't just seek sanctuary, she became sanctuary, a source of protection, inspiration, and light for people displaced by violence, poverty, and persecution. Through her advocacy, her athletic achievements, and her unwavering presence, she challenges the world to reconsider what it means to be a refugee. She embodies the truth that people who are forced to flee are not broken. They are strong, capable, resourceful, and full of promise. They are survivors, innovators, future leaders. She often says she doesn't want to be remembered simply as a swimmer or a refugee, but as a girl who didn't give up, a girl who faced wave after wave of war, fear, rejection, and uncertainty, and kept swimming. Not because she was fearless, but because she refused to let fear define her. Not because it was easy, but because she believed that her story could help others find strength in their own. And that's exactly who she is. She is the girl who swam through the darkness and into the light. The girl who turned a life jacket into a life's purpose. The girl who reminds us that sanctuary is not just a destination, it's a chance to rise. That's it for this episode of Sanctuary Stories. Next week, we'll be diving into another incredible journey, so stay tuned. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening. A huge thank you to Soulful Jam Tracks for the music. You can find all artist credits, references, and resources in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. It really helps. And if you have a moment, leave a review. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep striving, keep thriving.